All right, what's our k? -2. Perfect. So what's our axis of symmetry? X is equal to -3. Don't forget to put that x is equal to. And then what's our domain? All real numbers. All right, let's graph our vertex. So we're going to go to the left 3 and down 2. And our axis of symmetry is a dotted line that just goes right through the middle. How do we find our second point on our graph? Plug what in? -2. Anything close to the axis of symmetry. So since our axis of symmetry is -3, -2 works. So we have a negative on the outside, -2 plus 3 squared minus 2. All right, for PEMDAS, what should we do first? Parentheses. So what's -2 plus 3?
1.
So we have -1 squared minus 2. What comes next?
Wait, so is the 1 negative or is
Nope, the negative's on the outside, so only the 1 gets squared and the negative stays on the outside.
So if we square the 1, it'll be negative 1?
Awesome. We square the 1, so it's 1, but then that negative makes it a -1. So we have -1 minus 2, which is what? -1 minus 2.
Oh, no, negative. 12,
-3. So they're both negative, so we add the numbers together and keep the negative sign. So we plugged in -2 and got -3. So we're going to go to our graph. We go to the left 2 and go down 3. So that's our second point. Where's our third point? Same thing on the opposite side. Once we have our 3 points, we draw our parabola. So now we can see if we have a max or min and what our range is. So is our vertex at the maximum or minimum? Is it at the highest point or the lowest point? It's at the highest, so we have a maximum. And what's our maximum value? -2. It always comes from the second number in our vertex. And then what is our range? -infinity to -2. So since it goes down, we start with -infinity and end with the number, which is -2. So last step, let's look at our question and identify the transformations. What does this negative tell us is happening?
It is
What does the negative out front tell us? We flip it, but anybody remember what the word is?
it's with an S, right?
No, it's with an R.
R.
Reflection.
Reciprocal. Oh,
Thank you for your participation.
messed
But it
up
is
on that one.
reflection. All right, what does the +3 on the inside tell us? Left 3. And then what does the -2 on the outside tell us? Down 2. You guys got the hang of this. Good job. I'll zoom out so you can see. Okay, number 3. Again, this is vertex form, so where do we start?
Wait, can you go back?
H and K. So what's our H and what's our K? Perfect. We change the sign of H so it becomes -1, and K stays the same as -4. What's our axis of symmetry? X is equal to -1. And then what's our domain? All real numbers. So let's graph our vertex. We go to the left one and down 4. And then we put our dotted line right through it for our axis of symmetry. How do we find our second point on our graph? Plug it in. What are we going to plug in? Our axis of symmetry is -1. What's super close to it? -2. You can plug in anything you want for your second number, but we want to plug in something as close to the axis of symmetry as possible. So we could plug in -1, we could plug in 0. Those would be the best options. 0 would probably be the best because it's the easiest math. 1 plus 0 is 0. Not much thinking to do there. But we can plug in whatever we want. So let's plug in 0. Just because that one's going to be the best one here because we're close to the 0. So what's 1 plus 0? 1. And then what's 1 squared? 1. And what's 1 times -2? -2. So what's -2 minus 4? -6. So we plugged in 0 and got -6. So we stay on 0, go down 6. Where's our third point going to be? Same thing, but on the opposite side. Once we have our 3 points, we draw a parabola. So is our vertex at the maximum or minimum? Maximum. And what's our maximum value?
4.
-4. We get it from our second number in our vertex. And then what's our range? Awesome. -∞ to -4. Good job. Last thing we need to do is identify our transformations. So what does this negative out front tell us? A reflection. What about this 2? For multiplying a 2, what does that tell us? It's either going to be a stretch or compression. If it's greater than 1, what do you think? A stretch. So 2 tells us that we stretch our graph. And next we have a +1, so +1 on the inside. What does that tell us? Left 1. And then -4 on the outside. Down 4. So we have 4 transformations here. Any questions on this one? Ready for the next? If our graph opens down, which you should have this in your notes, if the graph opens down, our range is from -∞ because it points down to -∞, and then to k, whatever our k was up here. So like here, our k was -4. If our graph opens up, then our range is from k to +∞, because it points up to +∞. So this is for range. So make sure you have this in your notes. All right, let's go to number 4, last one in vertex form. So where do we start? Vertex. So what's our vertex? Perfect. 3, 0. We don't have a k here. We're not adding anything on the outside, so our k is 0. What's our axis of symmetry? X equals 3. And what's our domain? All real numbers. All right, so let's graph our vertex. we're going to go to the right 3 and stay on 0. And our axis of symmetry is our dotted line right through it. How do we find our second number in our graph? Plug it in. What are we going to plug in? If our axis of symmetry is 3, what should we plug in? 2. So we have 1/2 times 2 minus 3 squared. What should we do first for according to PEMDAS? Parentheses. So it's 2 minus 3. -1. And what's -1 squared? 1. And what's 1 times 1/2? 1/2. So we plugged in 2 and got 1/2. So we're going to go to the right 2 and up 1/2. Where's our third point going to be? Same thing, but on the opposite side. Once we have our 3 points, we can draw our parabola. Is our vertex at the maximum or minimum here? The minimum. And what's our minimum value? 0. It's the second number in our vertex, 0. And then what's our range? It opens up, so we start with what? Start with our k. What's our k? 0. And go to infinity. Last thing we need to do is identify our transformations. So what does this 1/2 tell us? A compression. And what about this -3?
Miss Carver,
Yes.
why does the 1/2 tell us that it's a compression?
So the a out front, so in vertex form, we have a times x minus h squared plus k. The a tells us if we have a stretch or compression. If a is greater than 1, it's a stretch. If a is in between 1 and 0, it's a compression. So if it is a fraction, it's a compression. So whenever you see a fraction, it's going to be a compression. So a stretch makes our graph taller and skinnier. A compression makes it wider and fatter. So another good thing to note for the quiz tomorrow.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Let's say a was negative. So if a is negative, what does that tell us? So from like example, question 2 in the notes, what does the a tell us? Or even the one before this, number 3. A reflection. So if a is negative, we have a reflection. Mm-hmm. Any other questions on this one? Any questions on vertex form? You guys ready to move on to standard form? So remember, vertex form, you always start finding the vertex. Where do you start in standard form? Axis of symmetry. So we did 5 in class together yesterday. It's on the video from yesterday's homework too, so if you missed anything, go watch the video. So here we're starting with the axis of symmetry. What is our formula for axis of symmetry? X is equal to negative b over 2a. Awesome. So we always need to find what our a is and what our b is. So what's our a? A is the number in front of the x squared. So what's the number in front of the x squared? 1. And what's our b? 0. So b is the number in front of the x. We don't have an x all by itself, so b is 0. So we plug it into our axis of symmetry formula. So x is equal to negative 0 over 2 times 1. What happens when you have 0 on top of a fraction? It's 0. So our axis of symmetry is what? X is equal to 0. How do we find the vertex? What's the first number in our vertex? 0. And then to find the second number, we plug 0 in. So we have 0 squared plus 4. What's 0 squared plus 4? 4. So what's the second number in our vertex? 4. What's our domain? All real numbers. So let's go ahead and graph. We stay on 0, go up 4. Put our axis of symmetry right through it. How do we find the second number in our graph? Plug it in. So we always are going to have to plug in two things when you're in standard form. You have to plug in to find the vertex and plug in to find the second dot. So what are we going to plug in here? 1. Plug in something as close to the axis of symmetry. Axis of symmetry is 0. 1 is super close. So we have 1 squared plus 4. What's 1 squared? 1. And what's 1 plus 4? 5. So we plugged in 1 and got 5. So we go to our graph. We go to right 1 and up 5. Where's our third point going to be? Opposite. Same thing on the opposite side. And we can draw our parabola. Is our vertex at the maximum or minimum? Minimum. And what is our minimum value? 4. Again, minimum always comes from the y value, that second number in your vertex. And then what is our range? Awesome, 4 to infinity. So in standard form, we find the minimum and the range the same way we did in vertex form. Yes. Any other questions about this one? Let's identify our transformations. So what does this plus 4 on the outside tell us? Up 4. So let's look at number 7. So this is standard form. Where do we start with standard form? Axis of symmetry. What's our formula for axis of symmetry? Negative b over 2a. So what's our a and what's our b? What's our a? For number 7? 1. And what's our b? It's plus 2. Oh, well, yeah, we would put a negative. But b is just 2, and then we put the negative 2 on top. Yeah, so you're just one step ahead. So we have negative 2 on top, and then 2 times 1 on the bottom. So this simplifies to negative 2 over 2. What does negative 2 over 2 simplify to? Negative 1. So what's our axis of symmetry? X is equal to negative 1. What's the first number in our vertex? Negative 1. How do we find the second number? Plug it in. So we have negative 1 squared plus 2 times negative 1. What is negative 1 squared? 1. And then what's 2 times negative 1? Negative 2. What's 1 minus 2? Negative 1. So what's the second number in our vertex? Negative 1. So we go to the left one and down one. Alright, what's our domain? All real numbers. Let's also draw our axis of symmetry, so that goes right through our vertex. Now we need another point on our graph, so how do we find the next point? Plug in 0. So we want to plug in something as close to the axis of symmetry as possible. 0 is super close. So we have 0 squared plus 2 times 0. What's 0 squared? And what's 2 times 0? It's 0 plus 0. So we plugged in 0 and got 0. So we have our second point there. Where's our third point? Same thing on the opposite side. Once we have our 3 points, we draw our parabola. Alright, so it opens up. Is our vertex at the maximum or minimum? The minimum. And what's our minimum value? Negative 1. And what's our range?
Infinity, 0, infinity.
What was our y or our k? What's the second number in our vertex? Negative 1. So we start with negative 1 and go to infinity. So in the range, you always start with the smallest value. So if it helps to think about it that way, we always start with the smallest number and then go to the biggest one. So if our graph opens down, negative infinity would be like the smallest number, and then whatever your k is, that would be bigger. So here, negative 1 is smaller than infinity, so we start with the smallest number. So a little side note, always start with the smallest number in the range. Any questions on number 7? Last one. So again, standard form, where do we start? Axis of symmetry. What's our formula for axis of symmetry? Negative b over 2a. What's our a? Three. What's our b? Negative 6. So we have negative 3 over, negative 6, because the b goes on top. Negative 6 over 2 times 3. What happens to that negative times a negative on top? Becomes positive. So we get a positive 6 on top. And what's 2 times 3? 6. How do we simplify 6 over 6? What does 6 over 6 simplify to, guys? 1. So what's our axis of symmetry? X equals 1. Alright, what's our first number in our vertex? 1. How do we find the second number? Plug it in. So we have 3 times 1 squared minus 6 times 1 minus 2. So 3, what's 1 squared? 1. And what's 1 times 3? 3. What's 6 times 1? 6. So 3 minus 6 minus 2. What's 3 minus 6? And what's negative 3 minus 2? negative 5. So our second number in our vertex is negative 5. So we go to our graph. We're going to put our vertex. Go to the right 1, down 5. And our axis of symmetry just goes right through it. Okay. How do we find our second point now? What are we going to plug in? If our axis of symmetry is 1, what's something close to 1? 0. So let's plug in 0. So we have 3 times 0 squared minus 6 times 0 minus 2. What's 3 times 0? 3 times 0? 0. What's negative 6 times 0? 0. And what's, negative 2. So what's 0 minus 0 minus 2? Negative 2. So we plugged in 0 and got negative 2. So we go to our graph, stay on 0, go down 2. So there's our second point. Where's our third point? Same thing on the opposite side. So we have our 3 points, draw our parabola. It opens up. So do we have a maximum or minimum here at our vertex? A minimum. And what's our minimum value? Negative 5. What's our domain? All real numbers. And what is our range? Negative 5 to infinity. Good work, guys. So again, your quiz is tomorrow. Make sure you know how to do everything on the review. So the questions aren't going to look exactly like this. You'll have a question that asks you, what's the vertex? Another one that'll ask you, what's the axis of symmetry? So you need to know how to find what it asks you for. So on the questions on the review, it asks you for everything. So if you know how to do the review, you'll do fine on the quiz.